We're now at part 3 of my ongoing critique of Mike Winger's critique of progressive Christians. And at this point, we're going to turn to a clip that starts at 22 minutes and 7 seconds in, where Winger critiques what he calls, I forget, something like doing theology through storytelling, which he finds to be very subjective, a subjective approach to feelings, and unbiblical. So we'll play the clip. And he's specifically talking with respect to LGBT issues, but the implications are much broader than that. We'll play the clip and then I'll offer my own criticism.
If you're hurting them, you've got to be wrong. And so all we need is for people to say, hey, look, you're hurting me. So you have to change your theology. This, I'm going to coin a term here. I mean, I'm sure someone has said it somewhere, but we'll call it storytelling as truth-making. Storytelling as truth-making. So, like, let's say we hear a story about a gay man who felt outcast, depressed, suicidal, until finding love and acceptance in a progressive Christian community that finally embraced him and his partner as they are. And now he's joyful, and now he's happy, and now he serves in the church. That story is meant to tell you that you guys have to have this wrong. Because look, this man is very happy and satisfied now. But when he was doing things the way you say, he was very depressed and suicidal and unhappy. His story of satisfaction proves you're wrong. Now, you realize this is a different way of doing theology, right? You're used to maybe opening your Bible and going, well, it seems pretty clear. Here, instead, we're going to say, hold on, slow down. Nobody really knows what that means. We're going to listen to the stories of these real people. Aren't you supposed to love people? And so you feel that this draws, plus it feels nice, man. Like, and I'm not trying to deride it, I'm trying to understand the attraction.
Okay, we will stop share, and I'm going to now offer my critique. So in this video, Mike Winger is critiquing what he calls storytelling as truth-making. He says he's not trying to deride it, but he clearly is deriding it. He's very condescending, and if he's not aware of his own body language and how condescending it is, he really needs to become more aware, because that really inhibits your ability to communicate effectively with the people to whom you are condescending. So I would say that at the outset. Now, the central issue here, beyond what I find to be his very off-putting presentation, is that Winger is just, well, he presents doing theology as simply reading the Bible and saying, well, that's clear, and then not allowing experience to sort of cloud the way that you would read the Bible, bringing in subjectivity that might distort your reading of the Bible. And the thing that, and so, for example, while the Bible clearly condemns same-sex relationships, it's clear. And so when people are saying, yeah, but I don't flourish under the church's teaching, it's very hard for me, well, that in and of itself is simply not at all relevant. What matters is that the Bible is clear. Now, the general response I have to that is that Winger is simply incorrect not to acknowledge the fact that experience is an important theological criterion. And that is true for everybody. Everybody is influenced by experience in our theology. That doesn't mean that experience is infallible. Of course, it isn't. Just as our reading of the Bible and our interpretation of the Bible is not infallible. But experience is a theological criterion, one that informs the way that we think about doctrine. And if you don't recognize that, then that in and of itself simply inhibits your ability to reflect critically upon your experience. Now, let me give you some examples of this. That it was once common among conservative evangelicals, when it came to talking about gay people, to say, well, you can change your orientation. Conversion therapy was very popular. Of course, there was this well-known international organization called Exodus International that offered the prospect of changing sexual orientation. And of course, this brings us to the whole principle, ought implies can. So in other words, the idea is if you can, if it is possible, or I should say, if you ought to change your sexual orientation, it implies that you can change your sexual orientation. And that was precisely what Exodus International offered as a possibility for people who are same-sex attracted. If you really want to change and follow God's will faithfully, you can change. And Exodus International, for 37 years, they promised that. Well, they stopped promising that in 2013 when Exodus International closed up their ministry and issued an apology to the LGBT community that they said they had deeply hurt, because they said, in fact, there's not good evidence that you can change your sexual orientation. And they talked about all these multiple examples of gay people who had been profoundly hurt. Many of them had become suicidal, self-loathing, some having committed suicide because they had been told for years you can change your sexual orientation, and in fact they could not. So today, conversion therapy is held, or reparative therapy as it's also known, is held in wide repute, including among many conservative evangelicals. And why? Not because of biblical exegesis, but because of experience. Experience has changed the way that we think about conversion therapy. Now think about that from the other direction. Matthew 5, Jesus says this, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. So you can tell a tree is good if it's producing good fruit. You can tell a tree is bad if it's producing bad fruit. This kind of reasoning is reasoning from experience. And interestingly, Christians who condemn same-sex relationships have traditionally appealed to this reasoning as part of their apologetic against a gay-affirming position. For example, it has been very common to say that same-sex relationships are inherently unstable. And in particular, among men, there are very high rates of promiscuity among gay men. And the argument then is this is evidence of the fact that men, and women are not appropriate sexual complements of one another. That in fact, what you need to have stable relationships that produce good fruit is to have people that are of different sex, male, female. Can't have male, or female, female. And so that is an argument that actually appeals to experience for its validity. And you can't have it both ways, because if you can appeal to that argument as to support a non-affirming position, in principle, you can also appeal to that same kind of argument to defend an affirming position, which is what many gay people do. They say, for example, well, I'm a lesbian and I've been in a loving monogamous relationship with my partner for 38 years, and we are mutually loving and giving and serving one another in our community. And that is fruit of our relationship, which retrospectively then provides evidence of the validity of our relationship. Now, you may think that that's not a good argument. You may think that the prohibitions of Romans 1 or 1 Corinthians 6 simply override that, but it's simply foolish or delusional to deny that people do legitimately appeal to experience, including the experience of seemingly healthy, stable same-sex relationships, as evidence for the moral status of those relationships. Now, Christians in all sorts of other areas appeal to experience as well. So when I talk about these issues, I give the experience of growing up Pentecostal. According to Pentecostalism, there is, after conversion, a baptism of the Spirit that all Christians should seek. And the sign that you have been Spirit baptized is that you receive the gift of speaking in other tongues or languages. So when I was in high school, junior high and high school, I tried repeatedly to speak in other tongues and to be baptized, and I never received the gift of speaking in tongues. Now, that became part of my experience as I theologically reflected upon the claim that all Christians need to speak in tongues. Another thing was evident as well in my experience. I observed that the people in my church who spoke in tongues, and thus presumably had received the baptism of the Spirit, and thus the fullness of God's Spirit to live a holy life that is honoring to Christ, those people were not demonstrably better, or did not demonstrably show better character or virtue than people who were not speaking in tongues. And that was not what you would expect in terms of experience if the doctrine of Spirit baptism and speaking in tongues were true. You would presumably expect that there would be some demonstrable evidence that people who spoke in tongues lived holier lives, showed more virtue than people who did not speak in tongues, and I did not see that. And that experience also led me to rethink the doctrine of speaking in tongues and Spirit baptism that I received from Pentecostalism. That was part of my journey out of Pentecostalism. Let me give you one more example. This is one of my standard examples I always give from William Webb's book, Corporal Punishment in the Bible. In the book, Webb points out that the biblical authors consistently teach the prudence, the wisdom, the advisability of physically beating your children in order to raise them up in the ways of the Lord. And he brings together all the biblical teaching on this, and it includes the advice of beating them with a rod, something like that, a sebet in Hebrew, leaving scars, doing it in anger, hitting them in anger, and up to 39 lashes. And if you do that, you can raise them up in the ways of the Lord, and they will not depart from it when they are older. Now, the interesting thing is that Christians today who accept corporal punishment almost never, at least in North America, they almost never actually follow what the Bible teaches or what the biblical authors teach on this topic. Instead, what groups like Focus on the Family do is say, instead what you should do is you should spank your child only when they're very young. Spank them on the bottom with open hand and don't leave marks, and don't do it when you're angry. And what Webb points out is that is not at all what the Bible is actually, what the biblical authors are actually teaching about this. Note, by the way, that I am making a distinction between what the Bible teaches and what the biblical authors teach. Because I think at the end of the day, what we will find here is that there are things that the biblical authors teach, which experience tells us we ought not accept, and thus we ought not conclude that the Bible itself teaches that which the biblical authors teach. And corporal punishment would be an example of this. So, how did Webb change his own views on corporal punishment? Well, he had to focus on the family view, even though it wasn't consistent with what the Bible actually taught. But what really began to challenge him was he talks about, first of all, how his son, when he became a teenager, he developed a degenerative cognitive issue, which eventually brought his son, as he grew older, he declined in cognitive ability until he had the mind of like a 3 or 4-year-old, of a small child. And Webb noted that Focus on the Family had taught that, well, you should spank children before the age of reason, before they can reason with you. That is the best way to discipline them. So he tried to do that to his now adult son, who had the mind of a 4-year-old child. He would hit him. And Webb determined, I just cannot do this. This seems fundamentally wrong to me. And that forced him to conclude, or to look closer at the Bible and actually realize that he wasn't even following the Bible's teaching in the first place, or the biblical author's teaching. He was doing what Focus on the Family had advised, which seemed to him by his own experience fundamentally wrong, but he was not even following what the Bible or biblical authors were teaching. In the book, he then also talks about how he was sharing his insights into corporal punishment with a student at his seminary named Fanosi, who came from Ethiopia. And he asked, and in Ethiopia, it was very common for parents to follow the biblical teaching much more consistently and actually beat their children with whips and sebets and so on. And so he was telling Fanosi about how he was thinking that we ought not follow that teaching and offer different ways of thinking about and reading and interpreting the Bible, and asked Fanosi what he thought. And Fanosi thought, or he said, Fanosi responded by lifting up his shirt and showing all the scars down his back that had been left from when he was a child and his father had beat him. That is another example, I would submit, of just showing the fundamental wrongness of physical beating of your children. The experience of seeing a young man traumatized from his youth by the fact that his father had repeatedly beat him in the name of God and left scars all down his back. It is that kind of experience that forces one to return to the Bible and say, maybe what the biblical authors teach on a particular issue is not what the Bible is trying to teach us. The Bible is not trying to teach us. The lesson is not beat your children. Maybe there's a lesson there to not spare authority from your children, but there's no denying that the biblical authors endorse physical beating of children, and we ought not to beat our children. One more bit of experience also supports that. You can raise children in the fear of the Lord as virtuous, good young people without ever hitting them, which is precisely what I did with my daughter, who's now finished her second year university, and we never had to hit her, and she did very well. Thank you very much. So those are all examples where experience forms part of your theology and forces you to return to the Bible and read it anew, whether it involves something like corporal punishment, or whether it involves teaching on spirit baptism and speaking in tongues, or perhaps, possibly, whether it involves LGBT issues. Experience is not infallible, but it is part of our theological process of hermeneutics, or the interpretation of the Bible and application of it for daily life. and of theology. And so when Mike Winger kind of derisively talks about this as storytelling as truth making and suggests you can completely ignore experience and just read the Bible. If it seems plain and clear to you, then that's all you need. He is simply delusional. And I guarantee that he is at that point simply blinded himself to the degrees to which experience also inevitably informed his own theology.